Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to the latest Cotswold Archaeology webinar. My name is Alistair Barclay. I'm one of the archaeologists working on the project. The talk tonight is about a cemetery and burials and burial mounds. Just as a disclaimer, we will be discussing human remains, and we might have a few images of skeletons as well. So just as a precaution. Right. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Steve Bush, who's going to talk about the discovery of the Netherhampton Road seminar.
Hello everyone, and thank you very much for the introduction there, Alistair. My name's Steve Bush. I work for Cotswold Archaeology and I'm based in the Andover office. I have had the privilege of being one of the few archaeologists who have been running the site at Netherhampton Road since November 2022. We're currently ongoing in the phase of works, and we're coming to an end of that. This leaves us in a position to be able to discuss what we found on the site and actually give our initial thoughts, our findings, and also some important artifacts we've uncovered. We're also going to give you a little bit of background information on the site, some important sites nearby. We'll touch on how we go from the beginning of the commercial archaeological phase all the way through to where we are now, where we have been, which is open area excavation. We'll have a quick touch on what other previous works was done on the site prior to Cotswold Archaeology's arrival. And we'll mention briefly at the end what happens next. Now, why is the site important? Well, the site itself, it's a rare opportunity to explore a barrow cemetery. In fact, this is one of the largest, if not the largest, barrow cemetery investigations to happen in the UK in the last 50 or so years. Now, there's several other companies who've been working in this area on the barrow cemetery, but we're going to concentrate on the works which have been predominantly done by Cotswold Archaeology today. The barrow cemetery itself also occupies a bit of a unique position where it's not only on the lower lying land, which is slightly uncommon for these features, as well as the more common higher ground. We also get to see a bit later on in the presentation why that it's not just the funerary remains which are present. We're also seeing the evidence of settlement going around these monuments for multiple phases. We'll also get to see how that settlement respects and in some cases amends these monuments to suit their needs. But before I go any further, obviously we're talking about a barrow cemetery. I think it's quite prudent quickly to touch what is a barrow. Well, a barrow is a funerary monument. They're often, as you can see on the picture on the right-hand side, over here, they're often earthen mounds or mounds with an outer ditch. These ditches are referred to ring ditches. So if you hear me talking about ring ditches later on in the presentation, this is what I mean. There's several different types of ring ditch. The ones we're going to be concentrating on in this one is the bowl barrow and the disc barrow. The bowl barrow is one of the most common types of barrow, but the disc barrow is a rare variant. However, in the Wessex culture where the site is, they are a little bit common, but still rare. And I'll come back to the disc barrows and the actual bowl barrows themselves shortly. Now, the barrows themselves, when they're surviving, and you look in the Stonehenge landscape, you'll see the mounds all across the landscape. On this site, several thousand years worth of agriculture have flattened them and leveled them. So all we're surviving with is the actual ditches themselves, which predominantly make up the mound material. Now, as I said, these monuments are commonly associated with burials. Now, we often get burials within the actual mound itself, underneath the mound, sorry, with the mound later put on. These burials are what we found on site. We often then get secondary interments, which are either in the actual ditch itself or, again, in the mound higher up. Well, sadly, after several thousand years of ploughing, if these mounds have been removed, sadly, so have the burials. So the site itself, it fits in an area very rich with prehistoric activity. And I'm just going to touch over quickly a couple of examples of prehistoric monuments within the near vicinity of the actual site. as well, and which are broadly contemporary in the periods we found during the excavation. So the site itself is, obviously, we've got the nearby Stonehenge landscape as well as Salisbury Plains. We've also got Cranborne Chase. And as you can see on the image to the left, there's a vast amount of prehistoric monuments all around this landscape. So you can't start, the first phase we're going to look at is late Neolithic, which is approximately 3000 to 2400 BC. Well, you can't look at that, you can't start mentioning that time frame without mentioning the likes of Stonehenge and Durrington Walls, which are located to the north, as well as Knowlton Henge to the southwest. We go to the Bronze Age, which is approximately 2400 to 700 BC. And as mentioned, you look in this whole landscape, you will see the remains of several barrows surviving, and even more in the actual fields, as you can see in the image to the right here. These are the remains, these are the ring ditches of barrows which have been long ploughed away. So southwest of the site, we have a barrow cemetery of approximately 29 barrows, and it's located at a place called Oakley Down in Cranborne Chase. This will give us a unique opportunity to compare two relatively close barrow cemeteries, to have a look at the finds of them and actually have a look at the size of the barrows and give a direct comparison from two locations, and if there's any difference in the actual sites. What is noted is during the Bronze Age, especially the late Bronze Age going into the early Iron Age, settlement activity in Wiltshire is quite rare to find, and which adds a little bit of importance to the site, as we believe we have got a late Bronze Age, early Iron Age dispersed settlement in one of our areas. We then go into the Iron Age, which is approximately 700 BC to AD 43. Now, there's numerous sites all around the area. So we have Little Woodbury, which is a settlement located to the east. And we have hill forts such as Old Sarum to the north, Chiselbury to the west, and Greater Woodbury Hill Fort, which is located to the east of the site, directly east of the site, near Salisbury Hospital. You also can't mention about the history of the area without mentioning Salisbury Hoard. Well, this was one of the most richest Bronze Age and Iron Age hoards found in this country, and this is believed to be found a few fields over from where the site was excavated. Looking at the history of the area, then go into an area of the Roman occupation. The Roman activity, the focus of Roman activity in this area was more closer to Old Sarum, where we have roads going down the Portway and towards Amesbury, which are believed to be on the original locations of the Roman roads. We do have a road running 2 fields over between the cattle market and the golf course nearby. But that is the only sort of known Roman activity within a few fields of the site. What this means is this area was in a hinterland of agricultural activity, and that the settlement was more focused away from the site, which is then shown in the limited amount of Roman activity we've uncovered. During the Saxon period, the area actually got quite busy. We know that in Harnham in 1853 and 1854, and the location of the very aptly named Saxon Road, a total of 64 graves were uncovered. You go a little bit forward to the west to Netherhampton. That started itself as a Saxon settlement. And then slightly further still, you've got Wilton. Now, Wilton was the capital of Wessex and the Royal Mint. So that area is quite important in the Saxon period. So that being said, if I didn't find any Saxon during the excavation, I'd have thought something was amiss. So how did we get to the excavation? Well, we don't just pick a field and hope for the best and start digging. There's several phases we undertake beforehand. This often starts with a desk-based assessment, which is a report which brings in all the information in the nearby area and brings it into a concise report. That starts analysing the sort of finds which we could potentially, the features and finds we could potentially find in the area. After that, as you can see on the plan behind us, we then start looking at a potential geophysical survey. Well, this is shown by the lines going across, and this is actually the first plan I'm going to show of the Netherhampton excavation. So we've got a series of ditches running across the site in linears. Also, you can see on the geophysical survey, little circles, which I'm highlighting now with a pen. This were the first sign that we are in the Barrow Cemetery. The excavation, the geophysical survey done by Headlands Archaeology noted that there was 12 ring ditches or barrows, former barrows in this area, which is what I've just showed you. But those who can count, those who are counting the number of circles will notice that there is actually 13. we have another ring ditch, which is the remnants of another barrow, which has been long ploughed out. That was masked by the colluvium, which was completely unknown about. There was no aerial photographs or anything else. So this was a complete unknown entity. So I digress. After the geophysical survey, if significant if remains have been found, we then go into our field evaluation. This is a load of small thin trenches, as you can see across here. This is to test the geophysical anomalies as well as to explore the areas around and below, areas of no evidence, to see if what we've got on the site. If significant archaeological remains are then found, it then goes into further mitigation. Now, all this work, it's all funded by the developer. If you're going to be doing a road scheme, a solar farm, a housing development, it's a part of the planning process that a scheme of archaeological works has to be implemented. And the series of steps I've showed you, just mentioned, are the processes which usually is followed. And then we end up in where we are, which is the open area excavations. Of note here, we have got a large Iron Age settlement, which I'll show you shortly. So we have 3 ring ditches. These were investigated by Headlands Archaeology and confirmed that they were real archaeology. This is an image of where Area 1 is. We have another 5 ring ditches here, in which only this ring ditch here was excavated on this phase of work. On the crest of the hill to the east and to the south, a further 4 more ring ditches were located. These 2 and these 2. Now, these are going to be protected in situ, and we're not going to have any further work done to them. What of interest is the actual shape of this barrow. This is oval, which indicates it's actually one of the earliest barrows in the cemetery, and it could indicate this is actually of Neolithic origin. What was also uncovered during Headlands phase of archaeology was a substantial Iron Age settlement. This settlement itself was approximately 185 meters long. And as with the 4 barrows on the crest of the hills, these will be protected in situ. So I've very briefly mentioned how we got to where we are, the previous work by Headlands, the background on archaeology. What we'll now go on is, what I'll touch on is the actual work undertaken by Cotswold Archaeology. We had 4 excavation areas. Area 1 to the north of the site, Area 2 slightly to the south of Area 1, and Area 3 and Area 4. Now, Area 3 and Area 4 are still under investigation, so I'll be able to give you brief information on that, but there is still an ongoing excavation. So Area 1, this is one of what we have done quite a few times on the site is take several drone photos to put the actual ring ditches, well, the surviving ring ditches actually in their landscape, actually show what they look like in the excavation area. This is one of the images where we were still under the stripping of Area 1 and Area 2. So Area 1, well, Area 1 comprised of 3 ring ditches, Area A, B, and C. Now, the former barrows A and C were very, very circular in shape, give or take the odd meter. They're almost exactly the same width as they are in length. However, compared to the former barrow B, it's actually quite squashed. It's subcircular. It's not a perfect circle as you would expect with some of the other ring ditches. What this means is that this could be evident of a earlier phase, or almost a link between the later Neolithic oval ditches and the more prominent, obviously, or circular early Bronze Age features. Now, the Bronze Age itself is split into 3 separate phases. We have early Bronze Age, which is dated 2400 to 1100 BC. We have the Middle Bronze Age, which is 1100 to 1500 BC, and late Bronze Age, 1100 to 700 BC. And what we'll do from now on is call them early, middle, and late. So Ring Ditch A. Ring Ditch A was located to the west of Area 1. what became apparent whilst we were stripping is actually it had two separate circuits, a very small inner circuit which measured only 12 meters across and an outer circuit which measured 33 meters across. Also, what became apparent during the stripping of the site is the further north we went, closer to the road, the more heavily disturbed by plough activity the monuments were. So to the north of each of the ring ditches, they were significantly shallower than the southern extent. The outer ring ditch was approximately 1.3 meters to the south, but where you got to the north, it was only about 70 centimeters. So you can show there's a significant amount of plough disturbance. The inner circuit, within the actual ring ditches themselves, no evidence of any human remains was actually uncovered. This potentially is due to, as I say, several thousand years worth of plough activity. What we did find on the actual monument itself, though, was outside of it, going around the extent here, which it doesn't quite show in the actual photo on the screen, we found several tree throws, which are the evidence of obviously trees growing up around a softer horizon. Now, we think this circuit of biotubation, rooting, hedgerows, tree throws is evidence of an external bank, which then would lead this interpretation to be potentially a disc barrow. Furthermore, looking at the fills of the ditch, there's no evidence of a substantial chalk deposition, which is obviously predominantly what these excavation areas are, is varying forms of degraded chalk or actual chalk proper. Now, if there was an internal mound, you would expect to see a lot more chalk coming into the actual ditches. We have none of this. So a combination of the lack of chalk in the actual fills and the halo tree throws going around the ring ditch, we suspect there was an outer bank, which once again, as with the mounds themselves, have long been ploughed away. We also found a small pit located to the south of the ring ditch, just over here. This pit had the remains of several different types of canine, not the whole skeletons, but actual several different individuals. This means that they were selective in what they put in the ground. To the northwest, although there was no burials found within the actual ring ditch itself, located in a tree throw to the northwest, in where we suspect the bank might have been, we found a crouch burial. This individual was buried in a tree throw and was actually only 20 centimeters from beneath the current ground level. So it shows how little topsoil, how little soil was actually covering these monuments. Now, this was the remains of an adult male. So sadly, no pottery or any other dating material was uncovered from this, but we can suggest, due to the that it was in the outer limits, that we think this is going to be of potential Bronze Age origin, or at least Iron Age. The fills of the actual ditch itself lent to support that the ditch potentially was open in the early Bronze Age, and by the later, it was still surviving in the landscape substant as probably a little hollow into the Iron Age, where we actually had later Iron Age pottery recovered from the other elements of the ditch. We move on into the central ring ditch on area 1. Now, this is the one which was slightly subcircular. It had two circuits, so an inner ditch, which was approximately 27 meters in width and had maximum depth of 1.3 meters, and an outer ditch, which was approximately 31 meters in length and 1.1. What we can see from the actual fills themselves is the inner ditch came first, and you can see where the outer ditch, this brown line here, is actually a later phase in modification. This modification extends the life of the monument itself. As we can see with the amount of fill within the inner circuit, it means that the inner ditch eventually gradually infilled through natural processes. Later, the outer ditch became recut, the feature. Within the confines of the central ring ditch, we did find several tree throws and animal burrows. Obviously, as with anything, they would prefer the softer geologies created by a mound. And they was quite prevalent on this in this area. Also within the confines of the central ring ditch, we found several burials. We found Beaker pottery associated with this burial, so we know that the central phase is dated to the early Bronze Age. The outer ditch, well, the first sign of any sort of datable material came about halfway down the feature, and that was dated to the Middle Bronze Age, with upper right at the top of the ditch itself. We ended up getting late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, and as with ring ditch A, it means that the outer ditch was still surviving in the landscape into the Iron Age, and where we have got that pottery filling in the feature. So one of the burials we found is, once again, it's a word we're going to use quite a lot on this site. It was quite unique. We actually found 5 crouch burials within the confined. Now, when we come across a site like this, it's the archaeologist's job to understand and try to figure out what's going on. And as you can see, that it is a mass of bones. So the actual, and I will say this, the actual pottery we got from this, although it was only small amounts of sherds of Beaker pottery, would suggest that once potentially there was a Beaker vessel in there. However, this burial, as with the other ones, was only 25 centimeters below the current ground level. This is a plan of the actual burial, and this here represents a plough scar which had gone sadly through and disturbed 4 out of the 5 burials. Furthermore, I mentioned about the animal activity. This burial group also had an animal disturbance going underneath them, so it had got a considerable amount of disturbance. The picture to the left is the team actually trying to understand what's going on, trying to excavate the skeletons, whereas the one on the right shows the positioning of them. So what we have is, from the left to the right, we have an adolescent burial in a crouched position with the adult, which is the red colour, overlying the arms of the younger individual. This is an adult male. To the right of the adult male, potentially facing the adult and actually going underneath the adult's leg, we have the remains of 3 juvenile burials. And this is where we found several pieces of Beaker pottery. Directly east of that central pit, we also found another grave. Now, I thought this photo is quite an interesting one. It actually shows the sort of material we're looking at. These graves are cut from the natural underlying geology and then very rapidly backfilled with the same material. Quite often, all we have to show for a sign of the actual burial itself is a slight different discoloration or an alignment of stones, which are not quite right. So if you follow around here, this is actually the grave cut, and you can see it's so similar to the surrounding geology. Now, this was, once again, as with the other central grave, this was only 25 centimeters underneath the current ground level. So very, very shallow graves. This was the remains of an adult female. What is interesting of this one is we actually have a complete Beaker vessel. And this is one of a couple of pottery vessels which are actually survived completely intact, although in this case, very squashed. When it comes to the Beaker burials themselves, they're often located, the burial artifacts are often located either in this position or at the base of the feet. And they're often put in the innovations are put in a crouch burial. So you can see the individuals are crouched over. During the previous evaluation work done by Headlands Archaeology, they also found a Beaker burial located within the centre part of this ring ditch. And to the left, this is the actual complete vessel they recovered, which is in very good condition. The vessel we've just showed you on the previous slide, it sadly hasn't survived very well through the last several thousand years. Now, Beaker, we call the Beaker period it's around about 2400 to 1800 BC. So that's still approximately just over 4,000 years. This pottery has been in the ground. So it's had 4,000 years worth of soil compaction. So in all fairness, it's no wonder it's actually survived in such a condition. We then go to the east of Area C, which we then go to the ring ditch there. Well, this ring ditch, as with other ring ditches in the area, showed a sign of modification, later modification. Although in plan it seems it's one circle, what we have found out from the excavation of this ring ditch is that actually the ditch itself silted up through gradual processes over time to be then later revisited and recut, which is extending the actual longevity of the actual monument itself. This ring ditch, ring ditch, it measured approximately 28 meters in length with a maximum depth of 1.15 meters. We had early Bronze Age pottery located at the basal fill, which gives it as a very good indicator that this monument, this part of the site, this monument, originated in the early Bronze Age. The middle fills, approximately 50, 60 centimeters up from the base of the feature, we've got Middle Bronze Age pottery, and then at the top we then got Late Bronze Age. So we've got the full sequence that this monument was open, the ditches were open throughout the Bronze Age. Inside the actual ring ditch itself, there was no burials again. This is probably due to historic ploughing. However, we'll come back to this in a second. There was an earlier pit just here. Located to the northeast of that ring ditch, we found a suspiciously circular shaped pit, which had burnt and crushed flint and heavy amounts of charcoal. Initially, when I saw this, and due to the fact that we were dealing with quite finely crushed flint, I suspected it might be something to do with pottery, flint tempering for pottery. So during the excavation, we started digging down, and it became very apparent that that wasn't the case. Approximately 10 centimeters underneath the burnt flint, which turned out to be a capping layer, we started finding the remains, human remains, the skeleton. So we have a skull, we have the long bones of the arms, and some ribs showing. Finally, this is the final excavation. So once again, we have another burial in the crouched position. The remains here was of an adult female, and we suspect that the burial itself was dated to about 1,500 to 11,000 BC. Now, although there was no datable evidence recovered from the skeleton, from the burial, it is quite common practice from the Middle Bronze Age onwards that the burials themselves will be capped with materials, mainly flint. And that we suspect, due to the fact that we had burnt crushed flint, that this might belong to the Middle Bronze Age burial. Now, we have looked at this burial, and the specialists have tried to find out examples of this type of burial being covered in burnt crushed flint. And as of yet, we've come up with no comparable examples in the whole of the United Kingdom. This makes this burial look very unique and quite an interesting one. Out of the ring ditches, well, we're not only just getting the evidence of the burials themselves, we're also getting evidence of human occupation and human activity on the site. Although these artifacts I've got on the screen, they're made out of flint, are residual in the nature, i.e. they are earlier than the actual fills they came from, or the feature, and they've just gradually infilled into the actual monument. It does show an interesting element of what is happening in the nearby facility. So what we have at the top, this is a late Neolithic oblique arrowhead. So we're looking around about 3,000 to 2,400 BC. To the bottom right, we have an early Bronze Age knife, and you can see around the edge where the flint has been worked, and it actually creates a really sharp edge. And then to the bottom left, we have another knife, completely different design. We suspect this is going to belong to the late Neolithic going into the early Bronze Age. So apart from the ring ditches in Area 1, what else did we find? Well, we actually found evidence of earlier activity belonging to the late Neolithic. So we're looking at about 3,000 BC to 2,400 BC. Now, this came in the form of 4 separate pits. One of them was located within the centre of Ring Ditch C, which had late Neolithic pottery. And we had 3 earlier pits in Ring Ditch B. And one of these, once again, had late Neolithic pottery associated with them. Additionally, in Ring Ditch B, we also had 2 other pits, one heavily truncated, and the other had a bit more survivability. All these contained antler. In total, 5 antlers were recovered from these. None of these antlers had signs of working, so they were deliberately put in the ground in an unworked condition. These antlers, we believe, came from red deer. What they would have used antler for in this time would have been the like of flint knapping or for the excavating of features. So to have this in their pristine condition, it is a bit strange. We will look into this further and what this could actually mean. What also is quite interesting is the location of the three ditches in every area B, ring ditch B. They are preceding the inner phase. It could indicate that the actual first phase of ring ditch C was deliberately located to actually transect them three ring ditches, showing that there was an element of significance to that site, which was already known. We then go to the Saxon period. And as mentioned here, if you hadn't found Saxon, I would have thought something had gone amiss. So to this area, we've actually found quite a little bit of Saxon activity. So to the west of area 1, we found a Saxon SFB, or sunken feature buildings. These are often little huts which are dug down to the ground, commonly associated with activities such as weaving, where in some examples elsewhere, we found the evidence of loom weights in corners of them. Sadly, we did not find any evidence on this site or any dating. However, the profile of this feature is quite unique. It's very, very steep-sided and flat-based. And it is exactly that on site. So we've interpreted this as a possible SFB. We also had several rubbish pits found in the centre of the area, containing evidence of animal bone as well as pottery. A little bit further around the area, ring ditch B, we also found 2 wells or watering holes, one to the northwest and one to the southeast. Now, the well to the southeast didn't have any datable material in it. However, the proximity to other settlement activity dating to the Saxon period and no other settlement activity in this area lends to the theory that this is obviously Saxon. However, we will look into this further. The well to the northwest of the site, and I will put a disclaimer, this looks substantially deeper than it actually is. This photo itself was given a false perspective. We stopped excavating this well at 1.2 meters and auged the base, which was only another 30 centimeters down. What we did find in that well is we found preserved timbers, so 1200 to 1400-year-old wood at the base of the feature. What we do find quite interesting is this piece of wood here was actually worked. We had evidence of branches along the sides being cut off. Currently, we're theorising what this actually could mean. We'll look at this, our specialists look at this at a later date, but this could be something to do with an aid to get in and out of the well, or due to the Y-shaped profile of it, this could be a rudimentary upright support. It's not just timber we found from this well, we also found pottery. Now, Saxon pottery, for the most part, is organic tempered, so it doesn't have that many inclusion. You can see here what the edge of the pottery looks like. Now, it doesn't take a trained eye to notice that there is an elephant in the room, so to speak. One of these pottery doesn't add in. Well, the pottery to the north, pottery to the right-hand side, upper right-hand side of it, is actually Roman Samian, which is a high-status Roman pottery dated the 1st, 2nd century. And in most part, when we've got extra pottery from different periods into features, it might cause a slight issue with dating. However, it is well known that in the Saxon period, they did collect earlier Roman pottery, maybe because it's of better quality than they made, or it's a fascination of a time gone by. So it is well known that you often find Roman pottery in later Saxon features. But it's not just the pottery we found on the site. In the actual watering hole itself, we actually found several knives, and this is one of them. You see it's heavily corroded. It's been ground once again about 12 to 1400 years. So the fact it survived this well is quite surprising. This is one of 2 knives we found from here. Now we go on to area 2, which is directly south of it. So what did we find in area 2? Well, once again, we found the 2 ring ditches, the one we was expecting, which is this one here, and another one to the south. To the north, sorry. This is unknown, and like I said, mentioned earlier, this was covered in clothing, which matched the geophysical survey. What we also have here, this long alignment, which you see on another slide here, which is this one here, is what we call a lynchet. It's a agricultural plough scar for intensive purposes. But this one was dating to the Bronze Age, the Iron Age Roman, and we can see it here. It goes over both ring ditches, substantially truncating the actual features. We also have several linears, pits, and post holes, which we'll go over and cover in a second. So, ring ditch D. Well, ring ditch D measured approximately 20 meters in width, and it had a maximum depth of 80 centimeters. I did mention about how heavily truncated it is. We can see already, you can see the substantial difference between the size. This down here was 80 centimeters. This here is 10. So you can see how much of the actual monument has been lost. From the base of this feature, we also found early Bronze Age pottery, which we're still in investigation, but we suspect that this is another food vessel. And this was right at the bottom of the actual ditch. So it comes with dating, you couldn't get any better than that. Halfway up, we've got Middle Bronze Age pottery, and the upper fields contained late Bronze Age, mid to late Bronze Age pottery. So we know that once again that this monument was surviving in the landscape all the way through the Bronze Age. What also is of interest is we actually found 4 burials. We found a central burial here, and we found 3 secondary interments. A crouch burial here, and 2 cremations, one here and one here. All these 3 burials were interred into the actual ditch of the monument broadly at the same time. We can actually see what level they've been, what level they were actually buried in, and they all occupy the phase between middle to late Bronze Age. So through process of elimination, we could probably suggest that these burials are all related to the Bronze Age, or to the Middle Bronze Age. The burial onto the east of the monument, which was buried in the actual ring ditch itself, well, it was of an adult female. You can tell by the shape of the burial itself, the actual pit is actually quite small compared to some of the others, and the positioning of the bones have been brought in quite close to the body. This is enough to suggest that this burial was wrapped in some material before it was interred into the grave to actually create the very tight burial position it is in. What we have to the right-hand side, as I mentioned, there was 2 cremations. Now, these cremations were capped with a flint material, as you can see here, which created a sort of a capping level. This, as said previously, this is a practice quite commonly associated with the Middle Bronze Age and onwards. So we could say, with the positioning of the ring burials in the ring ditch, that these are definitely Middle Bronze Age burials. Even though we had about 50 centimeters worth of overburden here, sadly, that doesn't mean that the actual monument itself was immune to the damage of historic ploughing. And sadly, as you can see through here, that is the remains of the plough scar itself. What we also found next to the cremations, and you can't quite see it on this slide, but approximately 1 meter this way, we also found a small post hole at the same level. The post hole was only about 20 centimeters in depth, which would suggest that the post wasn't massively tall. We're only probably looking about 60, 70 centimeters in height. Well, what point is having a post hole that height? Well, what we think that could be is a little marker or their version of a gravestone to denote that this is the location of the actual cremations within the ditch. As with the burials here and here, later on, the ditch filled up naturally and actually covered these features. Once again, we wasn't aware about these burials until we started excavating them. We move on to Ring Ditch E, which is located to the southern part of Area C. As you can see, this is a substantial ring ditch. We had an inner circuit, which measured 13 meters across with a maximum depth of 80 centimeters. We also had an outer circuit, which measured at least 33 meters across, with a substantial 1.65 meters maximum depth of the actual ditch. This goes to show how much material has been removed out to make the mound itself. What we did also find within the ring ditch is a series of stake holes which went around the inner elements of the outer circuit. This suggests that the stakes were put in to denote the limits of the ring ditch. So they were marking out where they wanted to dig before they actually excavated the feature, excavated the ditch. As for dating, but the inner ring ditch, it contained early Bronze Age pottery at the base of the feature, with Middle Bronze Age right at the top. We also had a central burial, which was on the cusp of the slope. This also contained a very early Bronze Age food vessel, which we'll show on the slides to come. With the upper ditch fills containing Middle Bronze Age pottery, what we can say from this is by the Middle Bronze Age, that inner ditch circuit had filled up and was no longer surviving in the landscape as it was. And at a later date, we have no evidence, any dating evidence from the base of the circuit, but probably 40, 50 centimeters from the bottom, we started getting Middle Bronze Age pottery. When the further we go up to the later, towards the top 60, 70 centimeters of the ditch, we end up getting late Bronze Age, early Iron Age pottery from the upper fills. And we're still analysing the pottery from this, so the dates might change ever so slightly. But what we think is we do have a late Bronze Age, early Iron Age settlement, which is in the landscape around the ring ditch, which we'll come to shortly. And we think that during this period of time, animal husbandry became more, was the main agricultural use. So what we think is we're due to the high quantities of chalk, which was noted in the upper fills, which isn't a sign of natural gradual infilling. We think in the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, whilst the settlement was being established and developing, the occupants of that settlement have come in and ploughed away and flattened this ring ditch to give them more space for the nearby settlement, which suggests that during a period from the early Bronze Age to the Middle Bronze Age, and then going into the later Bronze Age, the significance of this monument had changed. And then by the end of the later Bronze Age, in the early Iron Age, this monument was no more in the landscape, and it was just a flattened field. So in the central burial area in the ring ditch, we found a juvenile burial. We also found a Yorkshire food vessel, which was dated to approximately 3,500 to 4,400 years old. This food vessel itself was in surprisingly good condition, albeit there were several cracks along the side, which you can see here. This food vessel is of a Yorkshire food type. Obviously, as the name gives away, it's more commonly in the northern part of England. So to have a monument, to have this sort of vessel this far south is quite rare. What makes this even rarer is the vessel itself had a handle. Now, there's not many examples of these handles in it. Once again, this is quite a unique find, making this a very, very special discovery. As for the decoration you can see on the actual food vessel itself, you can see the very fine details going around the site with a little indentations. Now, we believe that due to the fine details, this was done by a quill, a feather. And then while you look at the side decorations, where we have just to the right of the actual cursor, you can see where it's slightly deeper, followed by a lighter indentation. Now, we believe this would have been made by bird bones to create the differentiation in size. Obviously, what we ended up doing was scanning the vessel itself to see if there's anything inside, and then later on we will be investigating in the residue found. As with area 1, we also find several residual artifacts located across from the actual ring ditches in this area. Once again, these will be residual. They are from earlier phases of activity, just gradually infilling into the ditches, but then themselves open up a unique insight to what actually is happening into the greater area. So as with the other area, once again, we've got another oblique late Neolithic arrowhead, with this one without the extension as the other one had in the previous slide. We also have a piercer, which is we believe to be late Neolithic, early Bronze Age. Now, these sort of piercers are given the name due to the actual edge here, and this was often used for leather working. And then the 5 artifacts at the bottom are called microdenticulars. Now, once again, we believe them to be late Neolithic, early Bronze Age. Now, these are, in basic terms, are serrated blades. I'm not too sure if you'll be able to see on the presentation, but you can see along the edge here, there is a serrated edge along here, as well as here, here, and here. So all in all, they're a serrated knife. So apart from the ring ditches, what else did we find in the area? Well, it's the same sort of story to a certain degree, that we also found late Neolithic activity in area 2. Once again, comprising of several pits. The first pit we're going to look at is this pit here. Now, although they're several thousand years apart, the actual ring ditch in the center actually interceded and cut through this later Neolithic, earlier Neolithic pit. What makes this pit quite significant, sorry, is the actual type of finds we found for a minute. We actually found pottery of Clacton grooveware, which is dated approximately to 2900 BC. Now, grooveware pottery originated in the Orkney Islands and started around about just before 3000 BC. So we can say in approximately about 100, 150 years, the grooveware culture was getting this far south, all the way to Salisbury from Orkney Islands. This is quite early in the grooveware period. Additionally, what else did we find on this in this pit? Well, we found a long bone pin. This bone pin is just over 25 centimeters in length, and it is near on complete. What we did find is we had found a historic break, which is probably why it was discarded, as well as several other fracture lines, which is probably caused by a fire. Now, itself, a bone pin like this, we've hypothesized that this is more likely to be a clothing item. So it's what they would have used to pin a fur coat together to stop it falling apart. Obviously, no zips and days. What we also found in this one, and what is probably of quite significant, is we also found daub, which is what ovens or houses were made out of this area. Now, the evidence of late Neolithic structures, houses, are very few and far between, as they tend to not survive this long in the landscape. So to have some sort of evidence of a structure in this area is very, very significant. What we also found in this, at the base of this pit, was hazelnut shells, and quite a lot of them. So they were burnt. So what we can see is we're actually looking at what somebody ate almost 5,000 years ago. Above this layer of hazelnut shells and the artifacts, we also found the remains of a substantial post hole. This post hole would have probably been a marker post in the landscape and would have been visible for quite some distance. The pit itself, the post pit itself, was approximately 80 centimeters in width, with the post probably about 60 centimeters. So once again, a substantial feature. Also around the area, the Ringditchy, there was another undated post pit, which had an equally sized post hole, as well as two other features, pits, which were contained no evidence, but were also of equal size to the one I've just talked about. We suspect that these potentially are also late Neolithic and relate to the same phase of activities as what we're seeing here. To the north of area 2, we found two separate pits, and very, very typical of Neolithic. One contained hardly any artifacts, a little bit of pottery, a little bit of worked flint, and the other one was absolutely rammed. So as you can see here, we're looking at the grooveware pottery vessel. Now, we'll look at the dates and we'll hopefully get a closer date later on the fade, but we can still say that this is relating to late Neolithic, so it's at least around about 3000 BC to 2400 BC. We also found other bits of grooveware pottery, approximately just under a kilogram's worth in total. We also found almost 3 kilograms worth of worked flint, including this 18 scrapers. Now, scrapers were deliberately deposited into this feature, and they wouldn't have weighed a lot to carry around the landscape. So this must have been a deliberate act of actually burying them. It wasn't just the pottery and the flint we found from the site. Once again, we found a third out of 4 Neolithic arrowheads on the site. We also found a clay ball. Now, I've asked the question when I was told there was a clay ball found from the feature. I thought, what is it? What does it mean? Well, we believe the clay balls are similar to other stone balls found elsewhere in the island. You look at the sites in Orkney; they're often found stone balls buried in them sites that far north. So we believe that they are of similar purpose. However, for that, what that purpose is still remains a mystery. What we also found from this one is some marine shells. So this one there on the screen here is actually a scallop. We also found oyster from the sea. So we are quite a long distance away from the ocean, even further if you consider that everything would have had to been walked. So to get marine species this far inland is quite surprising. So apart from the Neolithic, what else did we find in this area? Well, we found a whole host, a considerable amount of Bronze Age activity. Now, once again, the Bronze Age we consider as a period of time from 2400 BC to 700 BC. What is this? What could this activity mean? Well, we have this linear here. Well, it's not short enough to be. It's not long enough to be a ditch, but it's quite long in extent. So we're not 100% sure what that actually means, but we did find Middle Bronze Age pottery. Also in this area, we found Middle Bronze Age cremations with an additional 2 cremations here. This could be an attempt to combine these cremations here and actually have the significance of the ring ditch also extended over to here. This is going to be requiring further investigation. To the northeast of north and east on extent of area 2, we also found a very long feature here, several other features around it, which as you can see here, which is on aerial, the drone photos. Now this was dated to the late Bronze Age. What we've interpreted this as is a burnt mound. Now there's several different theories of this. It could be anything, what a burnt mound is. Well, predominantly consists of a mound worth of charcoal and burnt flint. There are several different theories what this could mean. This could be anything from evidence of a substantial feasting event to even going as far as prehistoric saunas. One thing which is quite common though throughout all the burnt mounds is we often find trough-like features nearby, which we have right here, as well as a water supply. But we found a watering hole here. So it does tick all the boxes that we are dealing with a burnt mound. A little bit to the south of the area, we started finding evidence of Bronze Age settlement, with a lot of the pottery coming back as late Bronze Age going into the early Iron Age. We also found evidence of domestic activities such as weaving. Now this here is a whirl, which is commonly associated with the weaving process. That's why a spindle wheel. This area here, as you can see, consisted of numerous amounts of post holes, and it was once again the job of the archaeologists to try to decipher what was happening in the area. What we ended up finding is we've got 2 parallel lines of post holes coming in here and another one coming in here. This created a cattle corral, or a line of fence posts where they can herd animal to and from. We also started finding that there was also divides in here, which are obviously for later field systems. A little bit to the south of this, we found several pits. Well, these pits are basically holes in the ground where the prehistoric people dumped their rubbish in. So we found evidence of animal bones and discarded broken pottery pieces. Here we've got a group of features. Well, the actual post holes themselves created a broadly circular shape, which was about 6 to 7 meters across. Well, this is too small to be what we would consider a roundhouse for occupation. This might be something like an animal pen or a small storage hut. Further still, we had a broadly rectangular structure. Now, when we start going into this area, the overburden was only, once again, about 20-25 centimeters. So a lot of the smaller discretes were really heavily disturbed, and some of them only had a depth of approximately 5 centimeters, which doesn't help with the interpretation. As you can see here, this was a broadly rectangular shape, but it does have several of the post holes where they should be missing. This is probably once again through to historic plough damage. Our interpretation of this little rectangular group of post holes is probably a little animal pen. Further south, come to here, but we've got a broadly circular shape, which is about 10-11 meters across. We're tentatively assigning this as a possible roundhouse. However, we would need to have a further investigation in the post-excavation side of things to confirm or disprove this. But once again, we did get late Bronze Age and early Iron Age pottery from here. To the west of these, we found a little granary structure. Now, granary structures are exactly what they sound. They are granary structures, but in the prehistoric, they consisted of 4 posts, which would be used to raise the grain up off the ground, so things like rodents wouldn't be able to get into their supplies. This is very typical of the Iron Age, where we have 4 posts here with a central support post to represent this. Furthermore, a little bit further to the west, we also then have an alignment of post holes here, a group of posts here. This probably makes out a rectangular structure which hasn't been fully explored at this time. Sadly, no datable evidence has been recovered from that. However, due to the actual size and the actual spacing of it, we do think this would be a rectangular building. So we've covered over briefly area 1 and area 2. We're going to go on to area 3, which is located to the the east of area 2. Now, after these are still under investigation, although they are coming to the end of the excavation. So we've got the evidence of settlement dispersed settlement for the Bronze Age to the west. What we're now getting is potentially the prehistoric trackways and roads to the east. When we were excavating this feature, what we did find is it was quite deep, approximately 60, 70 centimeters, which suggests it's a well-used holloway or trackway. We also did find in this area the remains of several ruts, cart ruts. So we know that we were on the original layer. Now, the pottery we've got from this is dating to the Iron Age. So we suspect this is somewhere between a 2,000, 2,700-year-old trackway, which is quite impressive to think of. What we also found is along the length of this trackway, as well as with the geophysical survey, and the trackway goes across the landscape from about here. It goes all the way through and out of the area. Now, intermittently along the trackway, we found several evidence of several pits. During the excavation, you can see these pits here. Now, these are chalk extraction pits. Now, the main purpose of these pits are to predominantly remove the chalk away from the actual road and actually from the actual ground to help and maintain the road. Now, this part of the site is going down a slope, so it would have been quite awful conditions in the winter, so they would have needed to do quite a lot of maintenance. This trackway then continued into area 4, which is this here, where it joins up with a second trackway, which extended across the landscape to the southeast. Predating these trackways, we also found the evidence of several earlier ditches. Now, the proximity to a late Bronze Age, early Iron Age settlement, we suspect that, and how they predate and actually go underneath the trackway itself, the Iron Age trackway. We suspect that these are field systems relating to the late Bronze Age settlement here. So only a couple hundred meters away. The sparse amount of pottery and flint we're finding from the actual features will also indicate that we are on the edges of the actual settlement. So, but once again, we are still we're still investigating this area, and I'm sure we'll be able to give further information at a later date. So to recap, why do I think this site's important? Well, not only did we get to take part in, like I said, one of the largest Barrow cemetery investigations in the last 50 years, we also got to see how the burials were interred into the ground and how they were respected. We also got to see the evidence of settlement activity, how that interacted, and how in places it respected the burial mounds, the ring ditches, and in cases of ring ditch E, how the needs of that settlement ended up with that ring ditch being leveled flat to give the later Bronze Age settlement more space. We also get to have little hints of domestic life several thousand years ago with the likes of spindle wheels. We've got pottery. We've also can see what somebody was eating several thousand years ago, which is absolutely fantastic. We also get a brief glimpse of how garments were worn back in the Neolithic. So all in this is quite a significant discovery. So with that in mind, thank you very much for listening. What I would like to do now is just to do a thanks to a couple of thanks to some individuals who actually helped throughout the process. So firstly, I would like to thank all the archaeologists who were involved with this project, from the field archaeologists from Cotswold Archaeology and the archaeologists from the cross-art companies we also used. Their work has been absolutely exemplary. I'd also like to thank the specialists who support me. So I might be the project leader, but we have a wealth of specialists who are supporting me. So if I'm not too sure what I think we have specialists which will be able to help and guide. So I want to thank everybody who's actually helped in that project. I would also like to thank Vistry Group, who are the developer for the land and the people who have paid for the actual development, with special thanks to Lewis Tolley, Robin Potter and Nick Marsh. Additionally, I would like to thank Roland Smith, who's the archaeological advisor for Wiltshire County Council, who has been out on several site visits, who has helped us with helped us progress through the site, and has also given us some interesting information and help us interpret the site as it's developed. And also, I'd like to thank Heddon's Archaeology, who are the company who did the previous evaluation work and helped us get to the stage we are. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand back to Alistair, who will then will try to endeavour to answer some questions from the chat. And once again, thank you very much for listening to me.
Hello, everyone. We now have a question and answer session. Thank you for everyone who's been posting questions throughout Steve's talk. We're going to be joined by an extra panelist, Richard Gretorix, who is the director of the excavation, who'll be on hand to answer questions alongside Steve and myself. So I will now run through some of your questions and direct them to the speaker. Becky asks, this is a question for you, Richard, if that's okay. What has happened to the burials? Are they left in situ or have we removed them?
All the barrels that we encountered have been brought back to the office, where they'll be held until we can assess them over the next sort of 3 to 6 months. We have to get what's called an assessment report out by the end of December, and the burials, whether they be cremations or inhumations, the crouch burials, will be assessed, and then later on we'll do full analysis. But we already have a pretty good impression of, you know, whether they're male or female, the sort of age, whether adults, adolescents. So we've got a pretty good steer already.
Second question. This is also for you, Richard. Were all the Saxon finds on the south or the north-south side of the road?
They're on the south side of the main road, but on the north part of the site, so in area 1. I can't think of any finds we've had from area 2 that are Saxon. I may be wrong, but the major features like the sunken feature building and the 2 wells and 1 or 2 sort of rubbish pits were all in area 1. So on the north side of that development, but the south of the main road.
Okay, thank you. Question for you now, Steve. Do we know why the inhumation burial outside the Barrow in area 1 was covered with burnt flint capping?
Currently, I answer honestly. Currently, I don't think anybody does. As mentioned to you in a talk, we know that in the Middle Bronze Age, it is a common process, quite common to be covered in flint material. This flint material is usually unburnt, which you can see in the cremation burials in area 2. The fact that we've got burnt flint, and it's not just burnt flint, it's very finely crushed burnt flint. It's definitely one to look into a little bit further in the post-excavation side of things and delve a little bit deeper. But as mentioned, currently with talking to the specialist, we currently haven't found any sort of comparable examples of this. So to answer your question, honestly, we don't know why that is. Hopefully a bit later further down the line, we might find another example somewhere, but at the moment, this is a very, very unique burial with no other examples we can compare it to. So,
okay, thank you. Thank you, Steve. Another question for you, Steve. Would it be possible to conduct isotope analysis on the burial with the food vessel to basically show whether the person had moved from Northern England?
Absolutely. Now, I do apologize. This was something I had a line I was supposed to say right at the end of the presentation, which was going to cover this. So I'll put my hands up and apologize for this. What we're tending to do at the moment is actually use some of the modern techniques compared to previous Barrow cemetery investigations to look at this. So, for example, you say about isotopic analysis. Well, we tend to actually definitely look at the multiple burial in area 1 to have a look at the isotopic analysis from the teeth to see if we can see if they were local, if they've moved into the area. Additionally, we're hoping to do some DNA testing if the condition of the bones allow it, to see if the 5 individuals buried within the same grave were actually related to each other. So it's this sort of extra modern techniques we can bring to bear on this the excavation, which will sort of set it aside from earlier investigations. So it's not just the isotopic analysis. We can also then look at other techniques. For example, the geoarchaeology, which then help us paint a picture of the landscape, not only as it is now or when the site going back several thousand years. So once again, apologies for not mentioning that in the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Another question for you, Steve, or for Richard, whoever would like to answer this. How unusual, you mentioned, Steve, that one of the barrows in area 2 was levelled, possibly in the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age. How unusual is this?
That's a very good question. That sort of question, I'll answer that question by going slightly off topic. What we're going to do now through the process of the works is we're going to complete the excavation, and we're going to the next phase, as Richard says, a post-excavation stage, where we start looking, and the specialists having a look at the finds, the flint and everything else. What we'll also do is start looking at other comparable examples. So we'll start widening our search to see if we can get any other features which have had the same sort of history, the same sort of leveling. But what I do find quite interesting is that is the only ring ditch out of the 5 we've excavated which has that site. So you look in the greater landscape, this might only in the nearby 13 ring ditches. You can see some of the later Iron Age trackways. They actually respect the surviving ring ditches and actually go around them. You've got the Saxon activity. It doesn't go into the ring ditches, it goes around this outside of it. So it is suggesting that this might be a one-off, and it's actually more, there might be other examples elsewhere, but on this site it is a one-off, and it's only because the settlement was expanding and it went straight up to the ring ditch, and it probably needed a little bit more space for that settlement. So in a roundabout way, it is unique for the site, but I'm sure there'll be other examples which we'll look at a later date.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Another question for you, unless Richard would like to answer this one. How unusual is it to find adult female burials within barrows in this area?
So it's you, Richard, if you want to get this one. Or...
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. It's not that unusual. What I suppose we'd like to try and find out is, obviously it's less usual for you to have barrows in or very, very close to the floodplain. Now the question is, are there more female burials on the sort of lower reaches of the floodplain? Are there more male burials up on the sort of hillsides, or are there more juveniles closer in the floodplain? So that's something I think that'll be really interesting to try and sort of look at from this side and then with other sites. It's not totally unusual to have sort of barrows in the floodplain. You do get them in North Wiltshire and Chippenham, for example, and you do get them throughout the Wylye Valley. So it's really a question of how we, the work we do now, and then as further developments happen throughout sort of Wiltshire, how we can compare them, because obviously the more pressure we have on development, more of these sites will be under pressure to be developed. So the more opportunity we will have to do comparisons.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Richard. A slightly different question now, Steve, relating to the Hollow Way. You mentioned the pits on the side of the Hollow Way or track. This have helped to maintain the road?
Absolutely. To the extent itself, if it was just like if we had an element of quarrying, if you look at some sort of prehistoric quarrying, what we often get is sort of a mass area of quarry pits, which is then for almost like an industrial process. What we have along the actual roadway, which is making us lead to more of the sort of theory that the actual pits themselves were excavated to extract the chalk from them to help with the maintenance on the track. It's really the positioning. If we got a mass amount of quarry pits in one location, then we could say that definitely that's being used for a particular activity. But the fact is they are flanking both sides of the ditch all the way down, so we can quite comfortably sort of suggest that they are relating to the actual the holloway itself, and they are being used to actually sort of repair. What we did also get in several places was redeposited natural, which is basically the chalk impact areas which have been compacted down. This sort of adds to sort of their understanding that, you know, it is a whole, the pits and the actual holloway are sort of one entity, and what we're seeing is gradual maintenance over quite a few years.
Okay, thank you, Steve. We've had a few questions about preservation in situ and the development. I think this is possibly a question for you, Richard. I think we probably need to clarify the damage done by cultivation, and why we've lifted some of the burials, just to sort of recap just how shallow the topsoil was. And I think, thinking back to some of the burial images, they were literally at the surface beneath the plough soil, and others no doubt have been lost. But if you could also say a bit about preservation in situ and the barrows that have now been taken out of the scheme and will be found within the new park that the developers are going to create.
Yes, as you've just mentioned, Alistair, and Steve made very clear during his presentation, is that a lot of these barrows have been badly truncated by ploughing, and you know, it's just a number of plough scars you've seen going through the barrels. It's indicative that when a curator looks at a site like this, they will consider, you know, the pressure, you know, on these monuments from farming. So they are already very, very truncated. So, you know, it's understandable that a site like this will be open for development. But one of the things we've been able to do as the project's progressed is to agree with the client and the curator, Roland Smith, to preserve 4 of the barrows that were due to be excavated, to be preserved in situ. Now, the reason some of these were due to be excavated was the client was intending to perhaps take some of the earth from the southern part of the site, the high part of the site, down to raised levels, the southern part of the site. Now they're still going to do that, but avoid the barrows. So we're going to preserve those in situ. They're being fenced off, and they'll become part of the country park. And we'll put some topsoil, subsoil over them, and bury them at a greater depth. And we'll look at the seeding of those areas so that the grasses there will provide, you know, a good barrier against erosion. So, you know, the sort of grass we seed there will be ones that will, you know, be more resistant to erosion. So that's what we'll be looking at. In fact, I'm just doing the what's called the archaeological management plan for that this week. So so 4 of the barrows involved will now be preserved. And also there's a school site. So we're looking at that with Roland and Melanie from Wiltshire Council when that comes up, to see if any of the barrows there can be preserved in situ. But of course that would depend on the sort of cut and fill you have to do for that site to give a, you know, a level site for the school. So it may be that we can preserve some of the barrows, but not all of them. But that's something we'll have to look at through the design for that site as well.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Now, our next question is from the same Melanie that Richard has just mentioned. Steve, could you just give a very brief recap? You mentioned a possible Neolithic structure. Could you just quickly describe that again?
Of course. Well, as with a lot of the, as mentioned, a lot of the late Neolithic houses and buildings, they simply put, they don't survive this long into the landscape. What we end up doing is get little brief sort of snippets of what could be there or what possibly was there. Now, what we found on the actual pit, which has the possible evidence of some other an oven or a building, we don't actually have the structure itself surviving. What we do have though is evidence of the meal, the sort of food they're having. Obviously the hazelnut shells. We also had evidence of daub, which is a material which is obviously used to make the buildings. So whereas we don't have the structure itself surviving, we do have some of the actual building materials which would have been used for that. Now, it's one of them ones, we don't have a lot of that daub. So was it actually brought into this area and deposited into the actual pit, or was this all surviving of a nearby structure? Now, these could be anything from an oven all the way up to a possible building. So with such a limited amount to look at, it is hard to say what sort of significance it could be. But all we can suggest is there was definitely some sort of activity going on in the area to the late Neolithic with all the finds we've got. But it's more than likely what it actually belonged to didn't survive, as we haven't found any evidence of it in the excavation locations.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Another question, one for you, Richard, this time. Was anything visible on LiDAR?
I'm not sure that I've seen any LiDAR for this site, but there's quite good coverage for large parts of Wiltshire, so it's quite possible there was. But the geophysics was pretty clear, apart from, as Steve pointed out, for the one barrow that was covered in the colluvium. So we had a pretty good idea for the major monuments from the geophysics, but it was all the small features, the pits and the post holes that we weren't aware of. And we certainly had in very large numbers certainly in area 2. For example, we probably had in area 1 probably 100 features more than we're anticipating, and in area 2 maybe 200 to 300 more. So, and those are the sort of things that you wouldn't pick up on LiDAR anyway. So, but yeah, LiDAR is becoming a much more important tool, and we'll be using more and more on sites like this, but it hasn't played a major role in this site.
Okay, and the very last question for Steve, back to the Holloway. Much of the route of the Holloway have we been able to map, and do we know where it was going from and where it was going to?
Okay.
And what was it for?
Well, the actual Holloway itself, I'll answer the last part of it first, which is probably the easiest part to answer. The actual Holloway is their version of a road. It's a mud track which they've used to go back and forth over it. Obviously, more it's used, the deeper it goes. The Holloway is kind of is a bit of a strange type of monument that the longer it's used, which is more of the recent activity at the bottom, it actually disturbs and destroys any of the original use, which is probably the older material. Now, we can't be certain how long that Holloway was in use for. However, we're hoping some of the pottery from that from the pits would actually indicate maybe it is potentially going into the late Bronze Age. Now, it's the date of the actual monument, date of the actual Holloway, which might indicate exactly where it is. Now, at the moment, looking at the landscape, the broad angle of the actual Holloway goes northeast, so broadly at the same sort of alignment as towards Old Sarum. Now, across the landscape, there's not enough been excavated from here, from the edge of the site all the way to Old Sarum to actually suggest that actually it continues through. And as far as I'm aware, and as what I've been told, there isn't any evidence of any Holloways going across the site, across the fields. But it does make to an interesting point. It could be linking up with other sort of nearby Iron Age sites. Additionally, there's a spur which goes off to the southeast. Well, as I mentioned right at the beginning, there is another hill fort to the southeast towards the Salisbury Hospital. It could be, once again, that this could be linking up to that. However, we're only dealing with such a small location in the landscape. Unless we have other sites across between gaps, we can't really be certain of exactly the route it's going. Like I say, for the northeast, what I said, the route which is going northeast across the landscape. This could go as far as the river, and it could just be used to getting cattle to and from the river, and that's as far as it goes. But without further investigation, it's going to be really hard to give a definite answer of where it is and what it comes to. But once again, that would be something we could look at further down the line in the post-excavation phases and see if we come up with some more plausible examples, looking at some nearby Iron Age settlements, and try to create a sort of a better picture of the routes and the sort of infrastructure in place in this time.
Okay, thank you, Steve. That concludes questions and answers, and in fact our webinar. I would like to thank everyone who's attended online tonight for your participation, for your questions. I hope you've enjoyed this. As I said at the start, it has been recorded and it will appear on YouTube. So if you know of anyone who didn't catch it tonight, please monitor our website for when it gets released. And if you would kindly take the time to fill out the survey as well, that would be appreciated. So I hope you've enjoyed this evening, and thank you on behalf of Cotswold Archaeology and my colleagues here. Goodbye.